Now in game number 2, we have Magnus Carlsen versus Ruslan Ponomariov. He's a very strong Ukrainian grandmaster. And in this game, Russell is going to go for a slightly different option than Dingley went for in the last game. Here, of course, on move 6, Magnus Carlsen goes for the English attack move. That is 6, bishop to e3. And as usual, Magnus has that plan of going f3, queen d2, long castle, g4, g5, and starting the kingside attack. Now here, Ruslan, he has a big choice. As usual, he can go e5, breaking in the center, or the e6 move, or finally knight to g4. Now in this game, Ruslan goes for the second option. That is the move e6. Now the idea behind this move is very simple. It is the Scheveningen style move, black getting those pawns on the d6 and e6 squares, fighting for control of all of these central squares here in the middle of the board. Now the disadvantage of this move over the idea of e5 is black lacks space in the center, and white is a very easy time going f3, g4, g5, and expanding on the king side. Now here Magnus goes 7 f3, the standard English attack idea, and once again from here you can go either queen d2 long castles, or for an immediate g4 and g5 expanding on the king side. Now already here black has a very important decision to make. What is he going to do from here to stop white's idea? Well, there are two main ideas. The first one involves going bishop e7 and short castles. And according to most grandmasters, this plan is actually very, very weak. Instead, here black needs to start getting counterplay going on the queen side with the move b5 immediately. Now, real fast, I do want to run through black's options. If black does go for that kingside castles idea, this is very weak. All Magnus has to do is go queen d2, and then long castles, and from here the plan is simple: g4, g5, trying to knock off that knight, then h4, h5, and g6, and white's attack literally plays itself. So overall, this plan's very, very weak. If your opponents play this against you, you should be very, very happy. You're going to have a very easy game as white. Now, alternatively, there is that other idea of expanding on the king side here with the move h5. We saw this in the line where black went 7 e5, instead of 6 e5 instead of 6 e6. However, here this move is a little bit weaker. From here, white can simply go queen d2, and then believe it or not, almost anything white wants to do from here is extremely playable. For example, if you want to go bishop e2 with a short castles, you can do that. If you want to go long castles, you can do that. If you want to go bishop c4 and then a4, try to clamp down on the queen side and targeting the weak square on e6, you can do that. Pretty much anything you want to do as white here is playable. And for that reason, this move h5 really isn't that popular for black in this line with e6. It's mostly seen in the line with e5. Now, going back to the game, the most dangerous move for black here, and in a good way, is the move b5, expanding on the queen side and immediately threatening the idea of b4. Now, why is this move so good? Well, again, black needs to get counterplay going on the queen side immediately. And from here, his plan may include knight d7, bishop b7, queen c7. And from there, he could even leave his king in the middle of the board and simply counterattack with the move b4 on the queen side. So overall, this is what black's going for here. Now in the game, Magnus follows up with the move queen d2. Of course, g4 also playable, but computers seem to show here black has a good game after b4. This is still playable for white, but instead queen d2 by Magnus is the best move in this position. So as a general rule of thumb, if you go bishop e3, then f3, then queen to d2, that's generally a good idea. Then you can decide if you want to go long castles or g4 first. Now from here in this position, Ruslan goes knight to d7, the very standard Nidor style move, and of course his plan is to follow up potentially with bishop e7 and queen to c7. Now real fast, I do want to show you if black goes b4 here or in almost any position in this e6 line of the Nidor. Here, white has a big choice. He can either go knight to e2 or knight to a4. Both of these moves are very playable. Now, b4 from black is not bad by any means. However, white is also doing very, very well here. Now, in this position, knight to a4 works very well. And there's a very important tactical idea I want to show you. What happens if black goes queen to a5? Well, this idea shows up again and again in the e6 version of the English attack. Here's what happens. If black goes queen to a5, the best move from white is actually b3, defending the knight. Now, if this is your first time seeing this position, you may be wondering what happens if black goes bishop d7, threatening bishop takes a4, then queen takes a4 after b takes a3. I mean, isn't black just winning a pawn here? Well, very importantly, white has the key resource here, a3. This idea is going to pop up again and again in these e6 lines. You just have to know this move a3 here. Now, the idea is if black takes the knight on the a4 square, you take the pawn on b4, and suddenly the bishop on a4 is pinned to the queen, and that pawn on b4 is defended by the white queen, the queen now have to retreat to the c7 square, and then you take on a4. Now, typically, white's already castled when black does this. So typically, b takes a4 is the only move. However, here, rook takes a4 is even better. But overall, you just got to understand these b takes a4 style positions where white wins a pawn. Despite having the weakened pawns on the queen side, white can still castle on the king side here, and white is going to be doing outstanding. So whenever you see this early b4 advance from black, you have to understand knight to e4 is a very playable idea, although knight to e2 in this position and in others is also very good for white. Now, heading back to the game, knight d7 on the board. This is the strongest move for black, and of course the idea bishop b7, queen c7, and b4 coming up next. Now here, Magnus does have a choice. He can either castle long on the queen side, or he can start the immediate king side attack with the move g4. Both of those moves are about equally effective. So either way, you're doing just fine if you play either of these moves. Now in the game, Magnus does expand on the queen side with the move g4. Now, it's very important to note, Magnus only did this when black already went knight to d7. Let's go back a move to this position right here. If Magnus here goes g4, then the threat of g5 isn't as scary because that knight has access to the d7 retreat square. Now, fast forwarding to this position here when Magnus actually goes g4, of course, that knight on f6 doesn't have d7 to retreat to, and that means g4 in this position is a little bit stronger. Now in the game, black stops the pawn advance with the move h6. Of course, if white advances g5, black is simply going to take back on the g5 square, and that will activate the rook on the h8 square, which is to black's benefit. So for that reason, Magnus does not go g5. Instead, he simply long castles, completing his queenside development. And this is really the end of the opening phase of this game, and this is where things get really exciting in this game. Now from here, black has a few different options. Once again, going bishop e7 and short castles is not a good idea. If black does that, all white has to do is go h4, g5, blow open the king side, and from there, black's king is going to be checkmated in short order, so that is not a good idea. Instead, black can go bishop b7 to try to continue queenside development. Now if black does that, here white has a wide variety of moves. A3 is possible, stopping the b4 advance. H4 is possible, intending rook g1 and then g5. And also the immediate rook g1, also possible here. So overall, white has a wide variety of plans if black slow plays it. Now the strongest move here, instead of bishop b7, is actually the idea of b4 immediately challenging that knight on the c3 square. Now from here, both the moves knight to a4, as we saw earlier, and the move knight to e2 is very, very playable. If white goes knight e2, this is good for white. Here's a sample line. Black may go queen c7, then white can follow up h4. The idea is perhaps rook g1 and then g5. On the other hand, if white goes knight to a4, it's a good idea to have in mind if you want to mix things up. Then the main line here actually goes knight to e5. Now this pawn on the b4 square is hanging. Of course, white can take it. That is the best move. Queen takes b4. And then if black goes bishop d7, trying to challenge the knight and potentially intending rook b8 next, then white simply retreats the knight to the c3 square. And as usual, if black instead goes for the move queen to a5 in this position, try to challenge the knight, then you just go b3, and the knight is defended, and white can actually follow up with a3, intending a takes b4, as that pawn is currently pinned. If the pawn moves, then the queen on the a5 square actually falls. These are some common ideas you may encounter in your own games, just good things to keep in mind. Now, in the game, black did not go for the strongest idea, b4. Instead, Ruslan Ponomariov tried to shock Magnus Carlsen with a very unusual move, knight to e5. Now, what's the idea behind this move? Well, it's a very common idea in the Najdorf, in the Dragon Sicilian, and other variations of the Sicilian defense. Here, black threatens knight to c4 ideas that would, of course, fork both the bishop on e3 and the queen on d2. This would force white to give up the dark squared bishop or that bishop on the f1 square, both of which are not good options, and beyond that, it also threatens the pawn on f3. And if white ever goes f4, then I will also target the pawn on the g4 square. So overall, the knight is reasonably active on e5. However, again, b4 immediately would have been a better move for black here. Now, in this position, what is Magnus Carlsen supposed to do? Well, as usual, in these e6, d6 English attack lines, white has a wide variety of ideas. For example, a3 is playable, rook g1 is good, h4 is good, all these very good moves. But here, if Magnus Carlsen decides to return the favor, and he wants to shock Ruslan Ponomariov with a weird-looking move of his own. So with that in mind, here Magnus retreats the queen back to the e1 square. Now, this is a very curious looking move. It is common in certain lines of the Dragon Sicilian, but here it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Yes, white is opening up the rook on the d-file, potentially threatening something taking on d6 in the future, but it's not really clear what the queen is doing on the e1 square over d2. Now from here, black goes queen c7, the best square for the queen typically in this line. And now Magnus here, he really needs to think about playing the prophylactic move a3, stopping the b4 advance from black, trying to punish black for not playing the move earlier in the game. However, instead of that, here Magnus immediately tries to start the kingside attack with the move h4, and finally black is in time to punish Magnus for this with the move b4. And after this move, we have a game. It's not really clear if white or black is better in this position. All right, as usual, white here has a big choice. You can either go to e2 or to a4. In this position, both moves are quite playable. Now from here, Magnus does retreat knight c to e2. This is a very aggressive idea. Now the knight is further away from the defense of the king. It's closer to the king side where it can help start that attack. And this means white's attack is going to hit faster, but black's attack on the queen side is also going to come a lot faster as well. Now the alternative, knight to a4, may be even stronger, but this move leads to insane complications. Here the best computer line shows black going d5, simply breaking in the center and guarding that b4 pawn with the bishop. Of course, the queen was targeting it just a move prior. And here the computer seems to think for white the best idea is actually g5 and immediately starting the kingside attack. Now, of course, this would have been insanely complicated. Overall, I quite like Magnus Carlsen's idea of responding knight c to e2 in the game as opposed to knight to a4. Keeping the knight on the e2 square, although it is a little bit worse, does keep the position simpler overall, which is to Magnus Carlsen's benefit in this game. Now from here, black jumps in with the knight to the c4 square, targeting that bishop on e3 just as we talked about earlier. That, of course, was one of the key ideas of knight to e5 earlier in this game, setting up knight to c4 ideas. Now here, Magnus Carlsen should really think about keeping that bishop on e3 alive. For that reason, either bishop f2 or perhaps bishop g1 would have been the right idea. Personally, I kind of like bishop f2 better, the idea being you keep the g1 square open for the rook, but bishop g1 also very playable according to the computer. However, instead of retreating the bishop, here Magnus simply jumps forward with the knight to f4 played in the game. This is a slightly dubious move as now white loses that dark squared bishop. Black takes on e3, white takes back with the queen. And now because of this, white is going to be much weaker on the dark squares in this game. Now from here, just take a quick look at this position. If you are even a beginner-level chess player, you may have spotted the idea that black can fork the two knights on d4 and f4 with the move e5. Now, did Magnus Carlsen miss something? Is this really a threat? What's going on here? Well, in the game, if black were to go e5, this would be a massive mistake. Here, white can jump in with the knight to the d5 square, targeting the queen on c7. And here, if black were to take the knight on d5 with the knight, let's say knight takes d5, removing the threat against the queen, then white can take back, and suddenly that pawn on the e5 square is being pinned to the king. E takes d4 is not possible because that would put the king in check. And of course, from here, the knight could jump into the c6 square, to the f5 square. I mean, there are so many dangerous threats for white in this position. So all this to say, in this position here, e5 from black, it looks very tempting, but knight d5 is a perfectly good antidote for Magnus Carlsen, and for that reason, Ruslan Ponomariov does not play that in the game. Now from here, what should black be doing? Well, it turns out when white doesn't have that dark squared bishop, black's king is a lot safer on the king side, and for that reason here, black should start thinking about how to castle his king, and that means developing the bishop on the f8 square. Now the best moves here for black are going to be bishop e7, intending short castles, or instead of that, the move g6, intending bishop g7, and only then short castles. So either way, black would have a very good game in this kind of position. However, instead of that, here Ruslan immediately starts to counterattack on the queen side with the move queen to b6. The idea of this move, of course, is the knight on d4 is now pinned to the queen, and the threat of e5 is getting more and more serious. However, beyond that, his queen on the b6 square also supports the idea of an a5 to e4 and then b3 advance with the pawns on the queen side. And if black pulled that off, white's king on the queen side would be incredibly vulnerable. Now here, Magnus Carlsen, he decides to jump in with the bishop to the c4 square. This move is now possible now that black went b4. When the pawn was on b5, of course, bishop c4, not a good idea. You'd lose the bishop. However, with b4 on the board, bishop c4 is a fantastic move, And just look at this position, the bishop, the knight, and the knight all overloading the e6 square. I mean, you don't have to be a very stable chess genius like Magnus Carlsen to realize that a piece sacrifice on the e6 square is inevitable in this kind of position. Now here it is black to move, and once again we have to calculate, is this idea of e5 dangerous for black or is it a bad idea? Well, it turns out in this position it is a very bad idea, even worse than on the move prior, and here's why. If black goes e5, the threat from white is not knight to d5. In fact, it's even more dangerous. Here, white can sacrifice the bishop on the f7 square. Bishop takes f7 is the move, and here's the idea. If the king takes, then there's a queen transfer you see a lot in the Italian opening for white. That is the move queen to b3, targeting the king, and then the best move for black is king to e8, trying to get out of trouble, but then white can jump in with the knight to the g6 square. And from here, you're targeting the rook. If the rook moves to g8, the queen simply picks it off. The rook has no good squares to go to. And overall, white is absolutely dominating this position. So e5, not a good move on move 16 here because of that bishop takes f7 threat from white. Now, what else can black do? It turns out the best move here is knight to d7. The idea is you're trying to get the knight out of the way of a future g5 advance. Of course, now that white went bishop c4, these rooks on d1 and h1, they are connected to each other, and that means g5 is a threat. If white goes g5, black takes a white takes, that rook on h1 is no longer hanging as the other rook does defend it. So overall, this move knight d7 gets out of the way of that attack. However, it does weaken the e6 square, and that means here white, of course, has that sacrifice on the e6 square, and here black's king is just blown the f open. This is going to be incredibly dangerous for him. Now, instead of knight d7, that was the strongest move here for black, even though it does weaken that critical e6 square. Here in this position, Ruslan Ponomariov goes for the move queen to c5. Now, this move has the idea of targeting that weak, vulnerable bishop on the c4 square. However, it is a big drawback. Here, Magnus simply defends the bishop with that same queen transfer, queen to b3. And now get a load of this, that two knights and the bishop and the queen are all overloading that pawn on the e6 square, and of course that pawn is not long for the world. Now here, what the heck is black supposed to do to hold off Magnus Carlsen's raging English attack? Well, according to the computer, the best defensive idea is queen to e5, trying to centralize the queen and supporting the e6 square with the queen. But of course here, white could also just sacrifice the knight on the e6 square, and this would be very difficult for black to defend. Now, instead of that, in the game, black goes for the move d5. This is actually a very common thematic break in this e6 English attack line. And this move has many different ideas. One is trying to gain space in the center of the board, and beyond that, it's also trying to activate this bishop on the f8 square, that bishop now having an open line of attack all the way down the board. Now, from here, Magnus does take on d5. This is the weakness of this move. And now here, of course, e takes d5 is absolute suicide. If black went that, white's going to follow up rook h to e1, targeting the king. And from there, he's going to win back that pawn on the d5 square. And, black pretty much has no chance in this kind of position. So with that in mind, instead here, black, he goes for the move bishop to d6. This is very strong, actually. The multi-purpose move, you're both targeting the knight on the f4 square, and you're setting up short castles, which would get your king to safety. So very good idea from black, but of course, Magnus Carlsen, he's not slowing down. He does not waste any time defending the knight on the f4 square. Instead, he immediately jumps in with the knight sacrifice. That's right, knight f takes e6 on the board. And now here, black has literally no choice but to take the knight. If you don't, white's threatening g7. White's up a free pawn. That powerful pawn on d5 is going to be a menace. So, of course, f takes e6 is black's only chance. But then after d takes e6, just look at this. Black's king literally never going to be safe in the center or on the king side. White has the 4 versus 2 pawn majority on the king side. And that means these pawns are just going to start rolling up the board, and black's king is in deep trouble here. Now, of course, white is down a piece. Black has those 3 minor pieces versus white's 2, and that does give him some fighting chances in the game. And from here, Ruslan Ponomariov plays the strongest move. That is bishop to e7, stopping any e7 ideas from white. So, for example, if he didn't play this, let's say any other move, perhaps bishop b7, tried to target f3, then white could actually go e7 in stealth. This move stops short castles. Of course, short castles would go into check now. And beyond that, if black ever takes that pawn on the e7 square, then white can follow up rook to e1. And again, look at these rooks on the e-file. This is very dangerous for black. Now going back, this move bishop e7 played in the game, best possible move for black. And here Magnus Carlsen, he wastes no time putting more pressure on the king. He jumps in with the queen to the d3 square, threatening queen g6 check. And if Magnus gets that move in, then black's king is permanently going to be stuck in the center. Now, of course, there were alternatives here. The move g5 is the strongest according to the engine here. And the idea of this is, of course, that rook on h1 is defended by the rook on d1, and black has no good response. Either retreating the knight or going h6 g5 would just create more weaknesses for black. Now, instead, queen d3 on the board for Magnus. And here black, he finally gets his king over to the king side, his short castles. Now, this was a good idea. However, the king is quite vulnerable there. Here, Magnus, once again, has the very easy idea of g5, sacrificing a pawn. The queen can technically win it back after h takes g5, h takes, then queen takes. However, this would open up the h-file for the rooks, and overall, this would be just a devastating idea for Magnus. Now, instead, Magnus decides to start slow playing the position. He goes bishop b3, and to be honest, this is the start of a slightly weaker overall plan for Magnus. Now, fortunately here for Magnus, black goes rook d8 in the game. This turns out to be a big weakness. Instead, the move bishop b7 is necessary. The ideas are setting up rook to c8 ideas, and finally, that rook on the a8 square can jump into the game. Now, instead, rook d8 on the board, and here Magnus does not miss his chance to sacrifice the pawn with the move g5. Now here, after this move g5 from Magnus, the first thing you have to ask is what happens if black takes on g5 with the pawn, then the queen? Well, it turns out that would be a fatal mistake. So for example, if h takes, then queen takes. What's the problem with this? I mean, you just win a pawn with a gain of tempo on the white king. Well, it's very simple. Here, white just responds king to b1, and then the follow-up idea, no matter what black does, let's say bishop b7, is going to be rook d to g1. And now look at this. Both of these rooks lining up with the king, the pawn on the e6 square, blocking off f7. I mean, this is an absolute disaster for black. The knight's coming to f5. You may even sacrifice a rook on g7 at some point. And here black is going to get blown off the board. So h takes g5, then queen takes, not a viable strategy. For that reason here, Ruslan Ponomariov goes knight to h7, just retreating the knight and trying to keep the game going. However, here Magnus, he doesn't slow down. He takes on the h6 square. G takes h6 is the move, and he actually gives up the knight on d4 if black wants it. Now, why the heck did Magnus do that? I mean, after all, after knight to h7, rook takes d4 was a legitimate threat. Well, here's the idea. If black takes on d4 with the rook, rook takes d4, then Magnus jumps in with the queen to the g6 square, and suddenly Magnus is threatening checkmate in one move, and black has a very difficult time defending against this threat. Now, instead of that, after g takes h6, the move for black is queen to h5, trying to guard the king side with the queen. But here, Magnus, queen to e4. Now, of course, the queen getting out of the way of the attack of the rook, the knight no longer pinned, and the queen targeting that weak rook on the a8 square. Now here, black takes on h6. That does target the white king. The white king goes to king to b1. Then rook to a7, getting out of the way of the attack of the queen on the a8 square. But now Magnus, he starts to go for the finishing blow. Knight to f5, targeting the queen, also targeting the rook on the d8 square. Now black takes the rook with check. White takes back. Queen to f6, getting out of the way of the attack of the knight. But here, Magnus Carlsen has a move that is so devastating, it nearly wins on the spot. If you like puzzles, go ahead and try solve this one right here. Try to find the best idea for white. If you can find this move, kudos to you, my friend. You deserve 5 Happy Meals. The key move for white here is the move rook d7. Wow, what a shocker. Of course, the idea is that black takes the rook with the bishop or the rook on a7. White's going to recapture with the e-pawn, and that's going to expose the king to an attack, and white's going to have that pass pawn on d7. So, for example, rook takes d7 is suicide. White takes on d7 with the pawn, and now you have the double attack on the king and the bishop. White's going to get a new queen. That is game over. Now, instead here, black takes with the bishop. Bishop takes d7 is the move. E takes d7 from Magnus. Now king f8. And finally, the key move, queen d5. Now from here, Magnus Carlsen is threatening checkmate on the g8 square, and black literally has 0 good responses to this threat. And for that reason, in this position, Ruslan Ponomariov resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen.